Hi everyone, Mitch here, and today I'm here with my dog Eclipse. Say hi, Eclipse. And we're driving in my car, and we're going to be taking a look and reacting to Brodie Robertson's new video, System D is not an init system. Let's see what he's got to say.
Something during it that made me want to go and make a video. Basically what he said was that over the past year, System D has had tons and tons of lines added into it, and this is crazy because...
Press the wrong button. My recording stopped, sorry. What?
System. Now, I'm paraphrasing, but that's the general gist of what he said. And from people that hate System D, this is a very common complaint, that your init system doesn't need over 1 million lines of code. But the thing is, this is just frankly not true. Not the fact that your init system does need over 1 million lines of code, or that System D doesn't have over 1 million. It's the fact that the init system in System D frankly doesn't have over 1 million lines of code, because System D isn't a single piece of software.
Okay, that is a true thing, and that's something that a lot of people who use Artix, by the way, we like to hate on System D for being this big monolithic piece of software, but it is broken up into multiple things that do different smaller things. And I want this is a fairly large but. System D is still a bunch of things that go together. Sure, you can kind of use some and not use the others, but nobody's using the init without the service manager. Those are fundamentally connected. I mean, okay, some distros like MX Linux use just the service manager and they don't use the actual init itself. I think Brodie might get into this though. I haven't actually watched this whole thing, so let's see what he says. Let me turn it on. Sorry I don't have audio, by the way.
I don't know how this myth ever started, because the System D website and the System D documentation has never described System D as an init system. It's always described it as a software suite.
Okay, this is one thing that I have an issue with. The documentation isn't what decides what things are. People talking about it is what decide what things are. You can't just say, oh, Vim isn't a minimal editor. It's never claimed to be a minimal editor. People still call it a minimal editor because that's what people call it. And technically, even if that's not really what it is, the meaning is there in what people call it. And people don't just call things stuff. They have an impression of something and then they give it a name, and even if that name is not accurate and you really hate that they're using the name, that's still what it's called. You can't just deny that. That's a minor nitpick. It doesn't mean anything. Anyway.
I'm not here to argue that System D or any of the tools contained within it are actually good at their job, or if they're efficient or easy to use, easy to work with, anything like that.
Okay, good, because they're not bad, but they're not that good. They're not as good as you could have, for precisely the reason that they're all System D. It's this big web of things that work their own way and do their own thing and aren't really Unixy. Okay, fine.
I don't think that's really relevant to the point of today's video. Personally, I don't have an issue running System D on my system, but that's just my experience.
Okay, fine.
If you're going to have a problem with System D, though, at least know what you're actually complaining about. Okay then, so what is System D? Well, as it says on the System D website, System D is a suite of basic building blocks for a Linux system. It provides a system and service manager that runs as PID1 and starts the rest of the system. Okay, that's all well and good.
That is all well and good, but here's the thing. Anything can be an init system, okay? Off the top of my head, I think I remember this, right? The only 3 things that you need to technically qualify for any particular program being an init system are: number 1, it runs as root. Number 2, it manages child processes. Number 3, it doesn't die. Bash can be your init system. You can literally cat bin bash into /sbin/init, which is the file that the kernel initializes by default, and you can like set it to systemd. I think a lot of kernels come with systemd init support precompiled in, but like Artix's doesn't. You can manually specify for the Artix kernel to use systemd on the kernel command line when you're in your bootloader, but you don't have to. Gentoo, I know you could I think you have a choice, and you could probably set it to anything you want. You could like hard code it, because Gentoo is cool like that. I've never gotten it to work, but it's cool like that. Anyway, I'm just saying, the requirements for being an init system are very low. You could also literally just write a bash script and use that as an init system. I'm gonna do a video on that when I get around to actually doing it, because it's pretty cool. I was gonna do it on FreeBSD the other day, but FreeBSD has this weird thing where it doesn't like let you modify sbin init for some reason. It's probably because it'll break the system, or they're afraid it'll break the system. I mean, it is sysv init, which is it's a house of cards waiting to crumble. So I can see that. Anyway, Brodie.
But what does that actually mean? We all know the meme that Linux is just the Linux kernel, and then to provide the useful functionality in...
Sorry. It turns out when I try to turn the volume up on my phone, it pauses the video, so this is gonna be a little bit janky and broken up in parts. There might be some bits missing, but I think we're safe now. I think we're fine. I just won't do that anymore. Anyway.
P, ls, rm, awk, sed, and all of that stuff that Linux is known for that actually makes it useful. But that's not the only software we have installed on our system. Just downloading your GNU suite isn't actually going to make the kernel actually do anything. So we're going to...
like I said, bash is the init. You can literally just have GNU, use bash as the init, maybe make a bash script. It won't be nice. You'll need like a bunch of firmware packages to get it booting on actual hardware, but you could boot just the Linux kernel and the GNU core utils if you really wanted to. Yeah, it would be a pleasant experience, but like, that's what Linux from scratch is. I mean, that's kind of what Linux from scratch is. Anyway.
Need some sort of bootloader to actually start up the kernel, and that's what systemd boot provides. And then once the kernel's actually started, we need to have some sort of init system, and systemd has an init system built into it. But we also need some, say, logging to actually make sure if anything goes awry on our system, we know what's actually gone.
There's this great directory that is on every Linux and I think most other Unix systems, /var/log. var log. What's on var log? There's a bunch of logs inside of var log. Various programs can log themselves. There's also, of course, the concept of standard error. And if you were to write your own init system, say, as a bash script, you could just set everything to, with the carety arrow thing, to direct all of its errors, which is code 2. So it'd be two caret arrow thingy. I don't know what it's actually called, but it's like shift period or shift comma or one of those keys on the American keyboard. That thingy, it like cats the output. It cats standard output by default. You can have it cat standard error. Just make entries. Just have a procedure that generates entries in var log that cat the standard error from all the programs that the init starts. It's honestly, it's trivial. There's no reason to have like this weird binary journal system, which is what systemd journal D is. Okay, whatever, Brodie. Let's keep hearing.
Wrong. That's what systemd journal D does. Oh. We need something to do timed jobs. Well, that's what systemd timer does.
Cron
we need some networking. That's what systemd network D does. And the list goes on and on.
I'm gonna stop you right there. Systemd network D. Why do we need? Okay, frankly, Network Manager is a horrible, extremely bloated program already. If you're on Ethernet, frankly, all you need is DHCP-CD, just something to communicate with your router to negotiate what your IP address even is, and then you have an IP address and a connection to the internet, and you are good to go. If you have to be on Wi-Fi, just install like IWD or something. Okay, fine. I mean, if you want, I guess you could use WPA Supplicant, but that program is also bloated and hard to use. IWD, by the way, fantastic tool. I don't know. I feel like I'm just memeing at this point because I'm saying how bloated and stuff these things are, and that you can do things minimally yourself. But like you can, and it works mostly fine, and you like actually understand it because you made it yourself. Anyway, no, just like having to have a network managing thing that is big enough to have to be part of your init system's peripheral suite of packages. That's just bizarre and frankly a little bit dystopian. There's something very wrong that's happened if we're like, there's nothing wrong with the program existing. It's just like reasonable people defending stuff like this. It makes you think, and it makes me a little bit sad. Okay, let's see what you got.
On and on for all of these very low-level tasks that makes our system just work the way we would expect it to work. I think this next part is definitely where some of the confusion actually comes from, and that is the way that distro maintainers actually talk about their distro. Now, obviously, it's not their responsibility to make sure you know what you're actually talking about, but it definitely doesn't help. And that is, if we go and download an ISO for a distro, let's say we download Foo Linux, and you can download it with OpenRC, Runit, sysv, and systemd. So 3 of these are definitely init systems. The first 3 absolutely are. There's no question about that. But then the last one doesn't really make sense to be in the same category, because if we get rid of systemd as our init system, we're probably not just changing the init system, we're probably also changing things like our timer implementation, swapping over to something like, say, a cron implementation. We'll probably need some sort of new bootloader, maybe something like grub, and that's the big difference. When you have systemd on your system, generally systemd is going to be used for more than just the init. One thing to note...
Okay, I think he's probably going to talk about this later. I think we lost it. Anyway, he just... For the future me who has to keep track of this, he just mentioned systemd, how there's a whole bunch of things, and if you were to have a distro that comes in both systemd and alternative init flavors like Runit or sysv or anything, you'd have to, the systemd one would have the Runit, basically like the Runit or the sysv one would have to have a lot of extra software that the systemd one doesn't, because you'd have to like replace systemd timed with cron. You have to replace systemd boot with grub, and it's really not just the init is the big difference. Everything else is a bigger difference. Yeah.
Though is if you have systemd installed, you don't actually have to use all of it. Now, obviously, you could just choose to have all of systemd installed and just not use the application. So that's not what I mean. What I actually mean is that if you install systemd, you don't need everything installed. You can just have the core components installed, which I believe are the init and the journaling system, and the rest of it is actually completely optional. So most people, when they install systemd, they're installing it as a...
Okay, no, because the systemd journal... What am I saying? Sorry. I'm driving at the same time too, and it isn't the best drive because there's a lot of very large cars on the road and the speed is changing a little bit. But we're good. Well, I probably won't crash, and if I do, that'll be bad and stuff. So I won't. But anyway, no, the System D, it's not just the init and the journaling system. The big thing with System D is the service manager. To overlook the service manager, the thing that actually like starts stuff in the background and manages the dependencies between background services, that's like the main innovation of System D. That is the one thing that System D actually does substantially better than most things that somebody could knock up in a weekend. Like, yeah. There's a lot of other things that System D components do okay or even do decently well, but the service management, it's terrible to overlook that. I don't know why he is. Maybe he's just like assuming that service management and init are the same thing, but they're literally not. Like, open RC and run it. Each of those can be used with the others init. OpenRC's service manager isn't even, Run It service manager isn't even called, what am I saying? It isn't even called, Run It, or like Run It service or anything. It's SV, and then, which I believe stands for service, and then that just does stuff. Even like, okay, we've mentioned OpenRC, we've mentioned sysv, we've mentioned Run It. We haven't really mentioned S6 at all. S6 is the other init that Artix Linux optionally includes, and it's a weird beast. I tried using it for a bit. I couldn't figure out how to add another TCY to get my X server started on Control-Alt F7, so I gave up on it because I'm lazy like that, and I hate display managers. But so I went back to Run It. It was kind of a pain to have to like reinstall all the Run It stuff because it conflicts with the S6 stuff, but we got there in the end. I had to like manually modify some files, but we got there. And so anyway, S6, there's actually, S6 has its own service manager that's like S6-service or something, but there's also, in the Artix repos, and very, very well supported, 66, like the letter 6 and then another letter 6. And 66 is a completely alternative service manager for S6. It uses the same S6 init, and I think it interacts with the same backend and it relates to the init in the same way. But the user-facing commands and the priorities of things are completely different. That's a thing, and let's not pretend it's not a thing. Service management is a big deal. And that's probably one of the main reasons you shouldn't make a bash script to your init system, but I digress.
Binary package. They don't really care about how it's actually being compiled. It's just from their system's package manager, and it just installs most of the suite without thinking. But if you go and compile it yourself, you actually can go and enable and disable certain parts with compile flags. And
again, that most of the people who do that are going to be people who use systemd with Gen 2. And I'd like to wager that the vast majority of Gen 2 users don't use systemd. That just doesn't seem like a very Gen 2 thing to do. So like, okay, whatever.
If you don't compile certain parts, they just won't be installed. So this allows you to have systemd managing parts of your system without having it manage everything that it possibly can. So if you want to have something different for your networking or your timers or your bootloader, you can very well go and do that without having to worry about the systemd application actually being installed alongside of it. I imagine the reason why most distros don't really bother doing this, though, is because if you're going to be using systemd to actually manage your distro, it only makes sense to commit to fully using systemd. Otherwise, why bother with the suite in general? It's not like the different...
Okay, I have one answer to that. I don't think he's going to talk about MX. I was really sad. I thought he was, because it's an interesting distro. But that last question that he asked, why would you ever not... Why would a distro ever not just go full systemd if they're going to include systemd? And the answer is something like MX Linux, where the actual SBIN init, it isn't a symlink to systemd. It's their own like modified form of sysv init, and it starts up some things, and if some service needs it, it'll also start up systemd as another service, and so you've got systemd, the service manager, running, but the actual init is a sysv based init. Because MX is based on Debian, a lot of Debian packages rely on systemd. They didn't want to be like Devuin and just rip it all out wholesale, so they do this thing where you can turn systemd on or off, and sometimes you'll boot with systemd, sometimes you won't. Like, you know, maybe systemd gets started and you see all the green OKs on the left, maybe it doesn't, and you see these weird blue things. I don't know. This is an awkward moment of silence, and I feel bad.
Tools that manage your system don't operate nicely together. It's just that there's not really any reason to go and do that when you have this entire suite that manages everything in your system anyway. I understand why some people don't like that idea, but from the distro maintainer's perspective, I imagine it makes things much, much easier. Now, there are legitimate problems with systemd that might make you not want to use it. Things like, say, the performance. Systemd, while it isn't going to be the slowest possible way you can manage your system, you could very easily make something worse. Systemd isn't intended to be the fastest init system, or the fastest journaling system, or the fastest timers, or anything like that. And you can find them say this in their FAQ. They sometimes chose to go with a slower implementation because it was going to be a way to make the code base easier to manage.
Okay,
and when you have a code base that large, sometimes that is a decision that you have to decide to make. Is it okay to sacrifice a couple...
Run it. I give you run it. It's a very small program. It could almost be considered suckless. It's just nobody bothers compiling it anymore because it's so small. You could just download it. I think it's like I want to say under 600 lines of code, but I kind of doubt that because that's really tiny. Like, some of my scripts, some of my like initialization files are larger than that, so I would worry if it was that small, but it might actually be pretty small. It's definitely under like 6,000 lines, I'm pretty sure. But like something like that, where you don't even need to maintain the code base, and in fact, Run It isn't maintained anymore, but it doesn't need to be, because it's been perfected. It works well enough that you don't need to worry about having this huge thing that's big and that is purposefully inefficient in order to be more understandable. You can just have something understandable and efficient and small and good enough to be perfect, practically. But Run It's not for everyone.
Of milliseconds here to make this entire function way more readable depends on what you're trying to do. In their case, they decided, okay, sure, we will do that. So if absolute speed is more important to you, maybe something else out there is going to be much better at the job. Another complaint that I hear is about lines of code. Now, I've talked about lines of code before and why they don't really mean anything, but I know there are some people out there who have a massive hard-on for lines of code. And on a source-based distro, this actually does matter because more lines of code means more to compile. That's a perfectly valid reason. And it will make binaries a little bit bigger. Not noticeably in most cases, but when you have like an extra 100,000 lines, sure, that definitely is going to be a problem. Minimal lines of code also just isn't a goal of the project. Another problem with System D is because some of its applications try to do stuff in their own unique.
This next point is going to be interesting, but I need to talk about the lines of code just for a second. Okay, fine, lines of code don't matter for compiled stuff, and System D is compiled, so okay, fine, you win. Whatever. We're all running binary distros anyway, nothing matters. Okay, fine. I give up.
Way, not trying to be compatible as their main goal, but still having compatibility be there if it is needed. Some applications out there basically depend on the System D applications actually being there. One notable case is with GNOME. Now, in the GNOME case, you actually can get it working without System D. It is just a lot of extra work that requires a lot of extra fiddling. It's not like you can just install it like you can on the System D system and it just magically works. And there are plenty of other things out there that may be potential problems stopping you from running System D. But this is why having choice on your Linux system is such a great thing. You can choose to go and run System D, choose something like Arch, or you could go and run something like Artix and just completely ignore it altogether. Go run something like OpenRC, go and install individual applications.
Yeah, okay, quick note about the GNOME thing. If you just install GNOME Minimal from the Arch repos and Artix, it works just fine. Sure, maybe Network Manager doesn't work, so a lot of... If you don't have GDM and you don't have Network Manager, you lose a bunch of things like the lock screen and stuff, but like just running the GNOME shell as a desktop environment on Wayland is perfectly doable. The main problem with running GNOME on non-System D distros, this ruined my time on Void the first time I tried to use... I don't know why I wanted to use GDM on Void, but for some reason I did, and it's awful, because the GNOME Display Manager, that's what GDM stands for, by the way, the GNOME Display Manager's error screen, it's basically a Windows blue screen of death. It's white, it says, it has a little frowny emoticon thingy made out of like a colon and a parentheses, but it's not even like text colon and parentheses, it's like very clearly a picture of a colon and parentheses turned on its head to look like an emoji. And it says, oops, a problem occurred. Contact your system administrator. That is the worst. That is not descriptive. That is not helpful. That is not empowering to the user or anything. That even Windows, even the Windows blue screen of death, even the Mac OS kernel panic or whatever, those give information. There's at least an error code there. Now, the error code probably means exactly what you would already know going into it because you were sitting at the computer when the error happened. Like, a lot of the, well, I know some of the Mac errors, it's like, you look it up and it's like, yeah, the error code means there was an error. But like, the GNOME Display Manager crash screen doesn't even give you the futility of having to look up an error code that tells you there was an error. It just dies. It just dies and locks the system up. Like, seriously, nothing else works. You have to like reboot and then try and kill it quickly before it starts. And it's but no, just like plain old GNOME on Artix is fine. It's display managers that are really weird and don't work properly, and that's display manager's fault. System D needs its own display manager to fix this, clearly.
To manage the rest of your system, and you're good to go. Personally, I'm running Arch Linux, so I run systemd. And I don't really have any love or hate for it. It doesn't really do anything that makes me really think about it. It just does its job in the background, and that's basically it. I don't need to ever think about it. But if you want to have a discussion about why systemd is bad and why nobody on Linux should ever run it, please know what you're actually talking about and understand that it was never and is never going to be an init system. The init system is just one little part of systemd, and not understand.
But everybody uses it as an init system. That everybody that uses it as an init, practically speaking. Even MX, like, it's practically the init of MX, because MX has it and it starts and it manages the services. Like, that's no init system is a pure init system. They all have service managers, and that's what makes, that's where the creep is. Like, the kernel can init, wait, no, the kernel can't init itself, can it? It sort of can. I mean, there is the init ramfs. You could make your entire kernel an init ramfs. That just works. That doesn't really need an init. The init is the kernel. And it's a full system that just runs entirely from RAM, and whatever. It is an init system. It's a system that initializes the system.
Understanding that distinction makes your argument sound considerably worse. That's it for me, and before I go, I would like to thank my supporters. So a special thank you to Joachim Donald, Logan Michael, Andrew Mitchell.
Okay, yeah, we're not going to listen to him list off his Patreon supporters. This has been kind of interesting, kind of cool, and kind of weird. I don't know how to feel about... Honestly, like, most of his points are good. He's kind of right. He's pretty right, and he's saying something that needs to be said that a lot of systemd haters don't want to hear. And as a person who has left systemd, I gotta say that his reason for staying with it is completely valid. It's like, you just don't care about your init system. It works well enough. Okay, whatever. Like, but the tools of systemd that do their own thing, I don't know, I guess it is what it is. Nothing matters, everything is fine, do what you want, it's your software. That is the GPL right there. I mean, not quite, there's some more things in the GPL, but like, software is provided without any warranty express or implied, including merchantability or fitness to a particular purpose. That's right. Who knows what the purpose of any software is? You just kind of use it, run it, see what it does, and then use it for whatever you want to use it for. That's where we really are here, and the distros that make systemd default, that's fine. This is the distros that provide alternatives for those of us who maybe don't want to run systemd for whatever reason. My reason for not running systemd is because I don't like the green OKs on the left. I prefer blue duns on the right. That's what... Okay, at the end of the day, it's all an aesthetic choice. Caring so much about distros and Unix philosophies and things is just gonna make life worse for everyone. But that's all for me. And before I go, I'd like to thank my supporters. Absolutely no one. Thank you, no one. I appreciate what you've done. And I hope that there will be more of you someday. So, thanks. Do maybe hit that subscribe bell. I may or may not post some more videos. And, yeah, thanks for watching, which you probably didn't. Oh well, bye.